Hello, this is Elizabeth Creamer. I'm a retired faculty member from Virginia Tech, the School of Education there, and the Educational Research Program. I'm coming to you again to provide an overview of a chapter from my textbook, An Introduction to Fully Integrated Mixed Methods Research, which was published by Sage in 2017. In this case, I'm providing an overview of the second chapter, which is really about the traditional purposes or reasons that have been given for using mixed methods research. And in this, I'm really giving you an overview of the chapter rather than really outlining the whole chapter or giving you all the key points. Those are available if you buy the book in the supplemental material. So my goals in this particular overview is first to explain what I mean by fully integrated mixed methods research, the title of the book. Then I want to talk about the principal reasons that have been used to describe the purposes of mixed methods research. I want to clarify how those rationales are established, tell you a little bit about how frequently each rationale is used, provide an example for 3 of those rationales, which I sort of picked arbitrarily because I like them, to tell you the truth, so I'm not going to review them all. And finally, to present some of the challenges for using a typology of purposes, or using the one that's been most prevalent in the literature. So in the book, my focus, unlike other textbooks, which tend to focus on a classic set of designs, in my textbook, I join Pat Baisley in a way in that my emphasis is on mixing, ways to mix at every stage of the research process, from when it is designed and the research questions are crafted, through when the data are collected, through the analysis stage, which most people consider the most important time to mix, and then finally in the process of drawing conclusions. Most people, or most of the foundational voices, seem to really assume that mixing and mixed methods mostly occurs at the final stage when you draw conclusions. I really think there's a lot of potential for it at the other stages, and that's why I really emphasize the idea of a fully integrated approach to mixed methods, even though only a small proportion of articles that are published fit this definition, and that certainly you can do some fine research without being fully integrated. But it's my argument that if you frame it that way, you really be maximizing the potential of mixed methods. Greene, Caracelli, and Graham, in a 1989 article in You See the Journal there, were the first to really propose a typology that became widely adopted of purposes or reasons for using mixed methods. They called those 1, triangulation, 2, development, 3, complementarity, 4, initiation, 5, expansion, 6 is one I've added, which I think is its own purpose, evaluation and intervention. I use this typology in part because not only has it been widely used, it still seems to be used and still seems to be viable. It is a really great place to start. I think Plano, Clark, and Creswell, in their most recent textbook, estimate that there are more than a dozen typologies of purposes, but I can guarantee you that this is the one that has been cited the most frequently, and Jennifer Greene has really been a leader in the mixed method movement since it was first conceived. So if I could give you a brief summary of these different purposes, you could sit there and be thinking, does my study fit one of these, and therefore does that further legitimize my plan to use mixed methods? So you could keep that in mind as I discuss these. Triangulation is kind of like the classic bedrock I don't think it is the most synergistic use of mixed methods, but it is a classic reason that it is used particularly in quantitatively dominated disciplines. Many disciplines use it only for this purpose. So triangulation fits the idea that validity is enhanced when you have multiple data points that converge. So in a triangulation study, you would have qual data and quant data about the same construct, and you would see the extent that those converge or confirm each other in order to enhance validity. Complementarity is a very wide umbrella, unlike triangulation. And really the purpose of a complementarity design, with that extra syllable, not complementary, but complementarity, is to build a more complete or comprehensive picture. That's the classic reason. That could be a theory building study. Usually that means that you've got qualitative and quantitative data about different constructs, sometimes different sources of data. Development goes back to sort of a narrowly defined design. It's a very clear one. It's a very easy one to apply. They're always two-phase studies. Couldn't have the second phase without the first phase. A development design classically is when the goal might be to develop an instrument in the second phase, and perhaps the first phase is a qualitative one, where you generate the items that would later be used in an instrument. Development design also applies to sampling. You might get a bunch of quantitative data to pick a qualitative sample, or qualitative data to pick a quantitative sample. And then the thing about a development design is you kind of walk away from the data in the first phase. Initiation is a very small percentage of articles in a very nice niche, and those always have the purpose of looking at different data sources to understand contradiction or paradox. They often follow a study where findings are unexpectedly either paradoxical or contradictory. Expansion, often done in schools and in hospitals, is always multi-level, collecting data from patients, nurses, doctors, administrators, or in a school setting, it might be students, parents, teachers, principals. That's what makes it multi-level. In evaluation and intervention research, the purpose of mixing is always to understand outcomes, to understand what influences those outcomes, and that's really a wonderful design. One of the tricky parts about distinguishing the rationale, and it's like a very little subtle thing, is when you study the Greene, Caracelli, and Graham article, you'll see that they sort of use language that goes between the purpose of mixed methods and the purpose of mixing, and they're really using them as the same thing. And that reiterates the point that if you have no intent of integrating your different data sources, then really mixed methods is not the right label. Multi-method is a fine label for that research. So when you use the mixed methods label, you're saying, hey, not only did I collect multiple sources of data, but it's my intent to integrate them in some way. So you have to distinguish the purpose of the study, the large purpose of the study, the aim of the study, from the purpose for mixing. And here I'm giving you an example from a study about ADHD, where the authors clearly address their study purpose to address gaps in knowledge by getting ADHD treatment perception from 4 stakeholders. So that 4 stakeholders is telling you multi-level expansion. But if you go down into their purpose for using mixed methods, their purpose is to combine qualitative and quantitative research methods that informed each other to develop an instrument. So see, if you judged it on the purpose, you'd say, aha, multi-level expansion, easy. No, when you look at their purpose for mixing, they're just doing it to develop an instrument, and therefore it's really better categorized as a development design. These labels are all about helping your reader understand why you're using mixed methods and how you're using mixed methods. It's sort of a common language. Two people have characterized or cataloged, counted the frequency and come up with pretty different results on the frequency of the uses of the designs. When Greene originally created those designs, Greene and her colleagues, she used strictly evaluation literature, which is sort of the founding home of mixed methods. And she found that most of them use that multi-level expansion, or the largest percent, 26%, use those multi-level expansion design, and close behind was that confirmation purpose that you see in triangulation. Bryman used a much wider data set. He had 232 articles, and coming from sociology, social psychology, management, and geography. And his data showed that the complementarity design was used well over 40%. I mentioned that's an umbrella term. It's sort of a default term if you're trying to get a bigger picture of a phenomenon, complex social phenomena. That complementarity label really communicates that purpose. So let me talk just a little bit about the complementarity purpose for mixing. I mentioned that it's to achieve wider, deeper, more comprehensive understanding. That's sort of the key language. Has no specific design features. It could be sequential or concurrent. And the example that I use in the text, and I like to use popular media examples in some cases, sometimes it translates, sometimes it doesn't, is a wonderful study, ultimately came starting in academia, ultimately moving into the popular press with the support of the National Geographic. And this is a study to understand parts of the world that have a disproportionately high representation of people who live above 100 years old. And they started originally with one here in Italy, this one here in Sardinia, but then they expanded to, in later phases, replicated the study, so to speak, and found 4 other regions, including one in California in the U.S. If you happen to be a U.S.-bound person, that might interest you. So the study started out with demographic data, quantitative data. Where in the world, across the world, do people live disproportionately above 100 years old? They're called centenarians. Then they sent an interdisciplinary team of people into those locales to study the flora and fauna, to study the eating habits, the social habits, to create a very large and comprehensive picture about the culture and the habits of the communities of people that live above 100. So it could fit under many designs if you looked at it in phases. If you look at the whole study, I think the purpose of mixing fits nicely under this complementarity design. I mentioned that the development design is an easy one to recognize. It's an easy one to tag. And I picked this one to talk about. Some disciplines only use it. But I picked it mostly because I love my example, to tell you the truth. There's a really cute example of the development design. I mentioned that it's always 2-phase, that you couldn't do the second phase without the first phase, and that's why it's called sequential. I mentioned that sometimes it's done for sampling purposes, but it's often done to develop an instrument, generally a quantitative instrument, and then the first phase is sort of qualitative, to collect a way to measure it more quantitatively. Some people call that quantitative measure objective. I'm mostly qual, so I don't think anything is objective, but most people would say if you can assign a number to it, it's objective. So I talk about the example that I want to use on my website, Mixed Methods Research in the News, and I call it Doggie Smarts, a rare use of a clever trouble by me. And it is about a study for canine intelligence. So at Yale, they are trying to find a quantitative way to measure dog intelligence. Why? They use dogs as companions for people who are ill or elderly. They're bomb sniffers. They can sniff out death. They have incredible capabilities. So they're trying to find a way to measure how smart dogs are. In the first phase, the qualitative phase, remember development has two designs. I just love this. They contacted dog owners who thought they had smart dogs. And they said, what does your dog do that you think is an indication that they're smart? And then they created a series of tests to administer to dogs to determine if they're how smart they are. So in this case, I love this picture. You see a picture of a dog at a computer screen picking between option A on the left, where the little red box is, and option B on the right. So in the second phase, as I said, of this development purpose, they found a way to give tasks to the dog so they could decide or establish a level of IQ. So I think that's a good and funny example of the development design. I'm quite a fan of this initiation design. If you remember the data I showed a little bit earlier, it actually only accounts for a very small percentage of articles. I think Bryman didn't put any articles in this category. But I think this article, this purpose for mixing, has some legs in that whenever I present, there's always someone or more than someone that has had the experience of not supporting a preliminary hypothesis, or of when you put two sources of data together, there's contradictions. And I, in fact, would encourage you to expect those contradictions. In the initiation design, you pursue them to understand them. You don't just set them aside and say, oh, it's a methodological weakness. My instruments were bad. I did something wrong. In fact, you see potential in it, possibly theoretical, in pursuing them. The chapter Exemplar in this particular chapter, and in most chapters, I do have an exemplar. In this case, it's an exemplar by Durksen and Klassen, and they studied pre-service, what in my day was called student teachers. And these are teaching students in schools of education or colleges of education during the semester when they first begin to transition into being full-time teachers, so pre-service teachers. And Durksen and Klassen found that their motivation had this nice, tidy U shape. So this is a U shape here. And that most people, most students participating recovered this motivation. This is graphing motivation, commitment and engagement, actually. And they discovered that most people did recover their commitment and motivation by the end of the semester, with a big drop in the middle. But they were intrigued in the students who did not recover. So some students, they all started gung-ho. By the middle of the semester, there's a droop. Everybody's tired already. Everybody's thinking, wow, this is a lot harder than I thought. Some students recover and their commitment engagement pops back up by the end of the semester. And some students, they discovered, did not. So that paradox intrigued them. And they wanted to understand, how can they help people in those situations? So I call this an example of the initiation design. It's what the article I feature in that particular chapter. In each of the chapters, I use a template, the same template, And there's actually some blank templates that you could do the same thing in the back of the book. And what's unusual about this template is really right here in the center. And that is appropriate because I break it down and really want to emphasize the potential to mix by stage. So I imagine multiple opportunities to mix, which introduces multiple possible reasons for mixing, which makes initial application of the Greene and Caracelli and Graham typology a little more complex. And because of that, I break down here in the middle, and what I think is moving the field forward, I look at, did they mix a design? And in this one, yes. Did they mix a data collection? Yes, and this is how. Did they mix during analysis? Yes, and this is how. Did they mix at the conclusion? Yes. And down here is sort of the conclusions they reach, and up here I've named the type of study, and up here I've called it initiation. So this kind of breaking down of when and how they mix could prove useful to you as you try to design your own study or consider how to evaluate your own study. So I mentioned that, the Durksen and Klassen study mixes at all stages. Unusual. That's unusual. I want to say up front, it's unusual, though I really ultimately had no trouble finding many examples that mix. They wouldn't even necessarily describe it that way. And this introduces the possibility that if you chose to use those labels, initiation, triangulation, complementarity, expansion, that there can be more than one reason for mixing. And when there's more than one reason for mixing, then the labels get a little bit more complicated, and you have to decide, okay, I have lots of reasons for mixing. Maybe it's not helpful to use the typology, or maybe I need to use multiple labels for mixing. In this particular example, we saw it at the design phase. We saw it because they had different research questions. Some were qual and some were quant. At data collection, because of how they collected the data, etc., through the way they sampled and analysis and drawing inferences. So in sort of wrapping up, I want to talk about the challenges and then thinking about practice so that I don't go on too long here. So I've mentioned some of the challenges. One is distinguishing between the purpose of the study and the purpose for mixing. The important thing is to be transparent when you write a purpose statement. Why did I pick mix methods? Why am I choosing to mix? That's your responsibility as an author, as a publisher, whether you're writing a dissertation or a journal article. Many people use mixed methods, however, without that transparency. And that's a weakness. It makes things harder for the reader. I've talked about with the Durksen and Klassen study that in complex multi-phase studies, particularly moving beyond the two phases that have been the focus of the foundational literature, there's often multiple ways of mixing and multiple reasons for mixing. Those should be outlined even though they cannot be fully anticipated. So you start out, and when you plan your study, you think, I'm going to mix at the inference stage, and then maybe you end up mixing in many places. And again, when you package it for the reader, you're trying to say, okay, I mix for this reason. That's what I'm talking about in this article. These categories are not empirically derived in the sense that they overlap. A study, as I mentioned, the blue zone, well, it could be described initially as a development design. If you look at the whole thing, the mixing was about complementarity. So there's considerable judgment in applying the labels like any category system. Most do not have a connection to the way the study is designed, no clear connection. The one exception is the development design. So when you think about practice, there really is one very important conclusion that I haven't talked about. Well, I've mentioned it twice before. I'm going to say it one more time. The real takeaway for you as a potential mixed methods researcher is you need to explain why you're using mixed methods and how you and why you intend to mix. Usually that's in your purpose statement. If you're clear in the beginning with yourself, it helps the design of the research as well as it helps your reader understand it. So that's really the most important takeaway lesson from this overview of the second chapter. I did a webinar for the Mixed Method International Research Association, and I'm on the board of that association and have been for quite some time. I'm quite a fan of it. And they have partnered with the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology in Alberta, Canada, to create a series of webinars which are archived. And I have a longer, more developed webinar there about purposes that goes through all the purposes. Those are free and open to the public if you wanted to pursue this topic further. So I've enjoyed chatting with you today, though we really haven't had a chat. The next overview I will be doing is about paradigms, and that's the third chapter of my text. Talk to you soon. Bye.